There is a certain kind of person who confuses others deeply. They feel everything yet reveal very little. They care intensely yet seem distant. They are present but somehow unreachable. These are the highly unreachable empaths. Their behavior is often misunderstood. People call them cold detached or emotionally unavailable, but this interpretation misses something essential. What appears as distance is not a lack of feeling. It is the result of too much feeling for too long without safety. Highly unreachable empaths are usually shaped early in life by environments where emotional attunement was required but not reciprocated. As children, they learned to read the room, sense moods, anticipate needs. Their empathy became a survival skill. But their own needs, comfort, protection, validation were often minimized or ignored. So they adapted. They learned that connection came at a cost, that being open meant being overwhelmed, that expressing pain might lead to dismissal, shame, or rejection. Over time, the nervous system learned a powerful lesson: closeness is dangerous. One strange behavior is withdrawal after intimacy. Just when connection deepens, they pull back, not because they don't care, but because care has always meant self-erasure. Distance becomes the only place where the self can exist without threat. Another behavior is emotional silence. They listen deeply, hold space for others, yet struggle to speak about themselves. Words feel risky. Vulnerability feels like exposure. Silence becomes protection. They may also appear self-sufficient to an extreme degree. Asking for help feels unnatural, even unsafe. Dependency once meant disappointment, so they rely on themselves even when exhausted. Perhaps the most confusing behavior is how suddenly they disappear. One day they are giving, present, compassionate. The next they are gone. This is not impulsive. It is the result of a long, invisible accumulation of emotional fatigue. When the inner cost becomes unbearable, withdrawal is no longer a choice, it is a necessity. Unreachability is not punishment, it is preservation. At some point, the empath realizes that empathy without boundaries becomes self-harm. That endless understanding does not heal wounds, it deepens them. So the nervous system does what it was designed to do. It seeks safety. Healing for these empaths does not mean becoming more available to others. It means becoming available to themselves. It means recognizing that compassion does not require self-abandonment, that saying no is not cruelty. That distance can be an act of self-respect. When unreachable empaths begin to heal, something shifts. Their empathy does not disappear, it becomes grounded. Their boundaries do not harden, they become clear. Connection no longer feels like danger because it no longer requires the loss of the self. And perhaps the strangest behavior of all is this: when they finally choose themselves, they become less loving. They become real. The highly unreachable empaths are not distant by nature. They are protecting a nervous system shaped by early emotional demands, a system that learned long before words that connection could be overwhelming and safety was conditional. As children, these individuals were often required to be emotionally present far beyond their developmental capacity. They learned to sense tension, anticipate moods, and regulate the emotional climate around them because their own stability depended on it. This constant vigilance trained the nervous system to stay alert, scanning for shifts in tone, silence, or disappointment. Empathy was not a choice but a requirement, a way to stay connected in environments where love felt fragile or unpredictable. When a child, as emotional awareness is rewarded while their own needs are dismissed, a quiet lesson is learned. The child discovers that being attuned to others brings approval, while expressing personal discomfort brings confusion, rejection, or withdrawal. Over time, the body internalizes this message. The nervous system adapts by prioritizing external awareness over internal signals. Hunger, fatigue, fear, and sadness are pushed aside in favor of maintaining harmony. This adaptation works in childhood, but it comes at a cost that becomes visible later in life. As adults, these empaths carry a nervous system that has never fully rested. They feel deeply, quickly, and intensely, not because they want to, but because their biology was shaped to do so. Emotional closeness activates old patterns of responsibility. Being needed feels familiar, but it also feels dangerous. Intimacy triggers the same alertness once required for survival. The body braces, the breath shortens, and withdrawal begins, not as a conscious decision, but as a protective reflex. What others perceive as emotional distance is often the nervous system seeking relief. Unreachability becomes a boundary created by the body when the mind has not yet learned how to set one. These empaths are not avoiding connection, they are avoiding overwhelm. They have learned that too much closeness can dissolve the self, that being fully available can lead to exhaustion, resentment, or collapse. So the system chooses distance as a form of regulation. Another layer of this behavior lies in how early emotional demands disrupt self-trust. When a child's internal experience is consistently overlooked, they stop relying on their own signals. They become experts in others while remaining strangers to themselves. As adults, this creates confusion. They may struggle to identify their own needs, limits, or desires. When asked how they feel, there's often a pause, not because there's nothing there, but because attention has rarely been directed inward. Highly unreachable empaths also tend to associate love with responsibility. Caring feels inseparable from effort, sacrifice, and vigilance. Rest feels undeserved. Receiving feels uncomfortable. When someone offers support, the nervous system may interpret it as a hidden expectation. Even kindness can feel intrusive when the body has learned that every gift comes with a cost. Distance then becomes the safest place to exist without obligation. Their silence is another misunderstood behavior. Silence is not emptiness. It is containment. It is the nervous system reducing stimulation after years of carrying too much. Speaking about personal pain may feel risky because past attempts were minimized or misunderstood. Silence offers control in a world that once felt emotionally chaotic. Disappearing is perhaps the most alarming behavior to others, yet it is often the final stage of self-protection. These empaths usually endure far longer than is healthy. They give chances, explanations, understanding, and patience until the nervous system reaches its limit. When it does, withdrawal is sudden and decisive. This is not punishment. It is the body saying enough after the mind has ignored its signals for too long. Healing for highly unreachable empaths does not begin with becoming more open or more available. It begins with learning to feel safety inside the body. It involves recognizing that empathy without boundaries is not virtue but survival conditioning. As the nervous system slowly learns that presence does not require self-sacrifice, distance becomes a choice rather than a necessity. When early emotional demands no longer dictate present relationships, something softens. Connection stops feeling like a threat. Rest no longer feels dangerous. Empathy remains, but it is no longer draining because it is no longer rooted in fear. The unreachable empath does not become less sensitive. They become regulated, grounded, and selective. Able to stay without losing themselves, able to care without disappearing, able to be present without the nervous system bracing for impact. What looks like indifference is often deep sensitivity that learned to survive by withdrawing. A quiet intelligence of the nervous system shaped by repeated moments where openness led to overwhelm rather than safety. Sensitivity, in its natural state, is receptive, responsive, and alive to nuance. But when that sensitivity is met with emotional unpredictability, criticism, or neglect, it does not disappear. It adapts. The system learns that feeling everything without protection is too costly, so it finds a way to reduce exposure. In early life, sensitive individuals often experience the world more intensely than others. Sounds feel louder, emotions feel heavier, and relational tension feels physically unsettling. When caregivers are unable or unwilling to help regulate these experiences, the child is left alone with sensations that are too big to process. Over time, the body learns that the safest response to emotional intensity is not engagement, but retreat. Withdrawal becomes a form of self-soothing when no external regulation is available. This withdrawal is frequently misread. From the outside, it can look like apathy, detachment, or emotional coldness. In reality, it is the opposite. The internal world of a deeply sensitive person is often rich, complex, and emotionally charged. Indifference is not the absence of feeling, but the dampening of expression. The nervous system lowers the volume to avoid overload, much like turning down sound to protect sensitive ears. As these individuals grow older, their sensitivity remains, but it is hidden behind layers of restraint. They may feel deeply moved by art, music, or the suffering of others, yet struggle to express their own emotions in relationships. Emotional sharing feels risky because it once led to misunderstanding or rejection. The body remembers those experiences even when the mind does not consciously recall them. In relationships, this pattern creates confusion. Others may interpret withdrawal as lack of interest or care. They may push for more openness, not realizing that pressure increases the very fear that causes the distance. For the sensitive nervous system, being pushed to feel or explain can trigger shutdown. The system perceives demand as danger, even when the intention is closeness. Another aspect of this survival strategy is selective presence. Deeply sensitive individuals often appear engaged in certain settings and absent in others. They may be warm and expressive in environments that feel safe, structured, or predictable, and distant in spaces filled with emotional ambiguity. This is not inconsistency of character, but consistency of self-protection. The nervous system is constantly assessing where it can afford to open and where it must conserve energy. Indifference also serves as a boundary when boundaries were never taught. If a child was not allowed to say no, withdrawal becomes the only available refusal. If emotions were met with dismissal or ridicule, emotional neutrality becomes armor. Over time, this armor hardens into a personality trait in the eyes of others, even though it began as a temporary shield. This pattern often carries a hidden grief. Deeply sensitive people who withdraw are frequently aware on some level of what they have lost. They sense the depth of connection they are capable of, yet feel unable to access it without risking collapse. This creates a quiet loneliness, not because they do not want connection, but because connection has never felt reliably safe. What is often missed is the intelligence of this adaptation. Withdrawal is not weakness. It is a creative solution devised by the body to survive emotional environments that exceeded its capacity. The problem arises when the environment changes but the strategy remains. Adult relationships may offer more safety, but the nervous system has not yet learned this. It continues to protect against dangers that no longer exist in the same way. Healing does not require forcing sensitivity back into expression. It requires creating conditions where the body can experience safety without demand. When deeply sensitive individuals feel respected in their pacing, something shifts naturally. The armor loosens. Expression returns, not as performance, but as authenticity. As the nervous system learns that it will not be overwhelmed or erased by connection, withdrawal becomes less necessary. Indifference gives way to presence. Sensitivity emerges not as fragility, but as depth, discernment, and quiet strength. What once looked like distance reveals itself as care that has been waiting for permission to exist. Without fear, their silence is not absence of feeling, but the result of years of emotional overextension, a long history of carrying more emotional weight than the system was ever meant to hold. Silence, in this context, is not emptiness. It is compression. It is the body learning to contain experience when expression no longer feels safe or sustainable. For those who grew up in environments where emotional awareness was demanded but emotional support was scarce, silence became the only place where the self could rest. From an early age, emotionally overextended individuals are often positioned as listeners, mediators, or stabilizers. They sense distress before words are spoken and respond instinctively. This sensitivity is praised when it benefits others, yet rarely met with equal care in return. Over time, they learn that there is little room for their own feelings. The nervous system adapts by turning inward, conserving energy through restraint rather than release. This pattern creates a paradox. Internally, there's intensity thoughts, emotions, memories, and bodily sensations moving constantly. Externally, there is quiet. The silence is not a lack of content, but an overflow without outlet. Speaking begins to feel like adding weight to an already overloaded system. Words require energy, and energy has been spent for years on holding others together. In relationships, this silence is often misinterpreted. Others may assume disengagement, indifference, or emotional withholding. In reality, silence often emerges precisely because of care. The emotionally overextended person has learned that expressing feelings can lead to conflict, misunderstanding, or further demands. Remaining quiet feels safer than risking another round of emotional labor. Another layer of this silence is the absence of permission. When a child's emotions are consistently overshadowed by the needs of adults, they internalize the belief that their feelings are secondary or burdensome. Even in adulthood, this belief persists. The body hesitates before speaking, scanning for signs of receptivity. If none are found, silence prevails. Silence also functions as a boundary when no other boundary feels available. For those who were never allowed to say no, not speaking becomes a way of not giving more than they have. It is a subtle refusal, one that avoids confrontation but preserves what little energy remains. This is not passive aggression. It is self-preservation learned in environments where direct self-advocacy was unsafe. Years of emotional overextension also erode trust in being understood. When feelings have been dismissed, minimized, or misunderstood repeatedly, the system stops offering them. Why speak if the outcome is more loneliness? Silence then becomes a response to relational disappointment, a way to avoid reliving the pain of not being met. There's often grief embedded in this quiet. Grief for the words never spoken, the needs never named, the comfort never received. Yet even this grief is held silently, because expression once came with consequences. The body remembers those consequences and chooses containment instead. This silence is not fixed. It is responsive. In environments that feel calm, respectful, and non-intrusive, it may soften. But in spaces that feel demanding or emotionally chaotic, it deepens. The nervous system is constantly evaluating whether it can afford to speak. Healing does not begin by urging these individuals to open up. Pressure only reinforces the belief that expression leads to depletion. Healing begins when silence is respected, not pathologized, when presence is offered without expectation, when listening is given without urgency. As the nervous system gradually learns that it does not have to perform or provide to be valued, something shifts. The weight carried internally begins to redistribute. Words return slowly, not as explanations or defenses, but as genuine expression. Silence then transforms from a shield into a choice. When emotional overextension is no longer the defining pattern, silence loses its necessity. Feeling remains deep, but it is no longer hidden under exhaustion. What emerges is not louder emotion, but truer connection spoken not from depletion, but from enoughness. Reachability develops when empathy was rewarded but self-expression was unsafe. A pattern that takes shape early and settles quietly into the nervous system long before it is recognized as a coping strategy. In many childhood environments, being emotionally perceptive is praised, while being emotionally expressive is discouraged. The child learns that noticing others, responding to moods, and anticipating needs earns connection, approval, or peace, while naming personal feelings leads to discomfort, dismissal, or conflict. This imbalance teaches a subtle but powerful lesson about which parts of the self are welcome. When empathy becomes the bridge to belonging, the child invests deeply in it. They become skilled at reading emotional cues, softening tension, and adapting themselves to what is needed. At the same time, their own inner world becomes something to manage privately. Feelings that do not fit the emotional climate are suppressed, postponed, or reshaped into something more acceptable. The nervous system learns to prioritize relational safety over authenticity. Over time, this creates an internal split. The empathic self becomes outward-facing, responsive, and engaged. The expressive self retreats inward, cautious and guarded. Because self-expression once carried risk, the body associates openness with danger. Speaking honestly feels like stepping into uncertainty without protection. Silence and distance feel safer than the vulnerability of being seen. As adults, this early conditioning manifests as unreachability. These individuals can be deeply present for others while remaining inaccessible themselves. They listen attentively, offer understanding, and hold space, yet struggle to allow others into their own emotional world. This is not intentional withholding. It is the continuation of a survival strategy that once kept connection intact. Unreachability is reinforced by positive feedback. Empathy is often admired, relied upon, even depended on. Being the one who understands becomes a role that brings identity and purpose. Meanwhile, moments of self-expression that do occur may be met with discomfort or subtle withdrawal from others, confirming the original lesson. The nervous system notes this and tightens its guard. Another aspect of this pattern is the fear of burdening others. When a child's emotions were treated as inconvenient or excessive, they internalized the belief that expressing needs causes strain. As adults, they may feel responsible for maintaining emotional balance in relationships. Staying unreachable protects others from their inner complexity, or so it feels. In reality, it protects the self from anticipated rejection. This unreachability often intensifies under stress. When demands increase, the capacity for self-expression decreases. The system defaults to what it knows best: empathy outward, containment inward. Emotional exhaustion follows, but even exhaustion is rarely voiced. The body carries it silently. There is often confusion and loneliness in this dynamic. These individuals may long for deeper connection while simultaneously pulling away from it. They may feel unseen despite being valued. This contradiction arises because being valued for empathy is not the same as being accepted for the whole self. Without safe self-expression, connection remains partial. Unreachability is not a flaw of character. It is an adaptive response to environments that welcome care but not truth. The body learned that survival required attunement without exposure. That lesson does not dissolve simply because circumstances change. It must be unlearned through experience. Healing begins when empathy is no longer the price of belonging. When self-expression is met with respect rather than resistance, the nervous system slowly updates its expectations. It learns that openness does not inevitably lead to loss. Distance then becomes less necessary. As safety increases, unreachability softens, empathy remains, but it is no longer one-sided. Expression returns gradually, guided by discernment rather than fear. The individual does not become less caring. They become more present, more integrated, and more real, able to be reached not because they force openness, but because it is finally safe to exist. Without hiding, these empaths disconnect not to punish others, but to finally stop abandoning themselves, a decision that often comes after years of quiet endurance and invisible self-betrayal. Disconnection is rarely the first response, it is usually the last. Before pulling away, these individuals have tried understanding, patience, explanation, and self-silencing. They stay longer than is healthy, hoping that care will eventually be mutual, that effort will be recognized, that their needs will matter without having to be spoken loudly. From early on, many of these empaths learned that maintaining connection required sacrificing parts of themselves. They adjusted their tone, minimized discomfort, and ignored internal signals in order to preserve harmony. Self-abandonment became normalized. The nervous system learned that closeness was safest when the self remained small, adaptable, and undemanding. Over time, this pattern felt less like a choice and more like an identity. As adults, these empaths often enter relationships with an unspoken contract. They will give understanding first, last, and always. They listen deeply, offer emotional availability, and absorb complexity without complaint. What they rarely do is ask for the same in return. Asking feels dangerous. It risks disappointment or conflict. So they continue to overextend even when exhaustion begins to surface. Disconnection begins internally long before it becomes visible. The body sends signals: fatigue, resentment, numbness, irritability, but these are often ignored. The empath has been trained to override internal distress in service of relational stability. Yet the nervous system keeps score. Each moment of self-betrayal accumulates, creating a growing sense of inner dissonance. Eventually, a threshold is reached. It may be triggered by a small incident, but the cause is never small. The body recognizes that continuing to give means losing the self entirely. At this point, withdrawal is not strategic. It is instinctive. The nervous system chooses distance as a means of survival, not retaliation. To those on the outside, this disconnection can feel sudden and confusing. It may be interpreted as coldness or punishment. In truth, it is often the first time the empath has chosen themselves. Distance becomes the only way to interrupt a pattern of chronic self-erasure. Without space, the cycle would continue indefinitely. Disconnection also serves to restore internal alignment. When an empath stops engaging in environments that require constant self-abandonment, the nervous system begins to settle. There is relief, even if accompanied by grief or guilt. Guilt arises because choosing the self contradicts years of conditioning that equated worth with giving. Yet beneath the guilt is a sense of rightness, a quiet recognition that something essential has been reclaimed. This withdrawal is not permanent by default, it is contextual. If the environment remains unchanged, distance persists. If safety, reciprocity, and respect emerge, reconnection may become possible. What matters is not apology or explanation, but a shift in relational dynamics. The empath, as system, is no longer willing to trade authenticity for attachment. Stopping self-abandonment often feels radical to those who have built their identity around care. There is fear of being perceived as selfish or unkind. But the truth is that self-abandonment was never kindness. It was a survival strategy learned in the absence of safety. Disconnection, in this light, is not withdrawal from love, but a movement toward integrity. As these empaths learn to remain connected to themselves, their relationships change. They no longer disappear into others. They no longer overextend to earn belonging. Their empathy remains, but it is anchored. Connection becomes a choice rather than an obligation. When disconnection is understood in this way, it loses its moral charge. It is not an act against others, but an act for the self, a necessary pause in a life spent giving without return. A boundary drawn not in anger but in clarity. A turning point where the empath finally recognizes that preserving the self is not abandonment of others, but the foundation of any genuine connection. Healing begins when empathy is redirected inward and boundaries replace self-sacrifice, a shift that challenges deeply ingrained beliefs about worth, love, and belonging. For many who have lived in patterns of chronic giving, empathy is always pointed outward. It has been used to sense others, soothe discomfort, and maintain connection. Turning that same quality inward can feel unfamiliar, even threatening, because it disrupts the role that once ensured acceptance and safety. Self-sacrifice often begins as adaptation. In early environments where emotional needs were overlooked or discouraged, offering care became a way to secure attachment. The child learned to earn closeness by being helpful, understanding, and undemanding. Over time, this strategy hardened into identity. Giving felt natural, receiving felt uncomfortable. Boundaries felt unnecessary or even cruel. Empathy directed inward asks a different set of questions. It invites curiosity about internal states rather than immediate responsiveness to external demands. It notices fatigue, tension, and emotional discomfort without rushing to override them. For those accustomed to ignoring these signals, this can initially feel like selfishness. The nervous system, long trained to prioritize others, resists the change. Boundaries emerge not as walls, but as acts of attunement, a signal where the self ends and other begins. When self-sacrifice has been the norm, boundaries feel disruptive because they interrupt familiar dynamics. Others may react with confusion or resistance, reinforcing the old belief that saying no threatens connection. Yet boundaries are not refusals of love. They are conditions for sustainability. Redirecting empathy inward also reveals grief. Grief for the years spent overextending, for needs unmet, for the absence of protection. This grief can be uncomfortable, but it is also clarifying. It marks the moment when the self is finally being taken seriously. Healing does not bypass this stage, it moves through it. As boundaries replace self-sacrifice, relationships are tested. Some connections weaken or dissolve, particularly those built on one-sided emotional labor. This loss can feel painful, but it also brings discernment. What remains are relationships that can tolerate mutuality, where care flows in both directions. The nervous system begins to experience connection without depletion. Internally, this shift creates space. Energy once spent on constant vigilance becomes available for rest, creativity, and presence. The body learns that safety does not require constant giving. Empathy toward the self fosters regulation rather than exhaustion. Over time, the system becomes less reactive, more grounded. This process is gradual. Years of conditioning do not unravel quickly. There will be moments of guilt, doubt, and the impulse to revert to old patterns. Yet each time a boundary is honored, the nervous system receives new information. It learns that the self can be protected without losing connection, that love does not demand erasure. Healing is not about becoming less caring. It is about becoming whole. When empathy includes the self, it gains depth and clarity. It is no longer driven by fear of abandonment, but by choice. Boundaries ensure that care is offered from fullness rather than depletion. In this state, self-sacrifice loses its appeal. Giving becomes intentional, not compulsive. Presence replaces performance. The individual no longer disappears into others or withdraws to recover. They remain with themselves, steady and available, capable of connection that honors both self and other, grounded in the quiet understanding that true healing begins when compassion finally comes home.